Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about drywall repair. Not just repair, but doing the repair the correct way, the right way, the best way, and the professional way. But first I want to tell you a brief little story about what led to all this. And I believe a squirrel got down in this vent right here. There's two vents coming out of this laundry room. And pipes need air for the water to flow right and to flow down, flow out of the washing machine and the sink in the laundry room and go down through the sewer line. Now, as you can see, I covered up these vent pipes with mesh, but I did this after the fact, and I highly recommend everybody does this right now on their homes to keep this from happening to you, because it is a common issue for birds and rats and mice and in this case the squirrels. They get down in there, and usually they can back themselves out. But this poor little critter was not able to do that and kept going further and further down toward the sewer line and just didn't make it and got stuck. And it was finally determined that it was all the way down and we needed a snake longer than 100 feet in order to get to that. So I had to call on a plumber, which was very defeating to me. My snake was not long enough, it was not powered, it was not, it was hope against hope for me to get this clog out, so I had to call in a professional because I am not a plumber. So here is the vent pipe where the squirrel got in, and here is the drainage pipe where the squirrel eventually got stuck way deep down under the house. The plumber just needed access to this straight pipe going down through here. So at first it was just like an oval shaped, cutout where they just smashed out the drywall to get to that. So from that hole, I had to make this whole square. So when you cut your vertical cuts to make things square, you need to find out where exactly the 2x4 is, even if you have to reach your hand back there and cut straight down the center of the 2x4. So the old piece of drywall can share half of the stud and a new piece can share the other half of the stud. If you don't do this and there's nothing behind that joint right there, eventually it's going to crack, and amateurs do this all the time. The vertical edge of the drywall needs to be nailed to a 2x4. So on this job I'm going to be using two pieces of drywall, because we have two unique problems on both pieces, so I want to be able to concentrate on one problem at a time. You can see over on the left side, the piece of drywall I'm going to be cutting is going to fit between this stud on the left and this stud on the right down the center of both of them. And that's so I can focus on this sink drainage pipe on the left side, and I need to put in a trap door on the right hand side, right here where this plug is. So if we ever have a clog again, the plumber can simply open a door right there instead of ripping out all the drywall, and he can unclog it through that plug. We'll be using 5 of these 2x4s to nail the drywall in. There's one by the door jamb that you can't really see too good. There's one right here. We're going to skip and not use this one. I'll come back to that in a minute. We're going to be using this double 2x4 right here. We're going to be using this one, and we're going to be using that vertical edge that's already shared by the old drywall. Now you see how this piece of metal is on this 2x4 running up and down? That's telling the drywall installer not to mess with that stud. And the reason this metal is on there is to protect that joint right here, because the last thing you want to do is put a drywall screw or nail into that PVC pipe, and you're going to crack it or put a hole in it. Now, technically, to code, there should be a smaller piece of metal covering this one right here, so the drywall installer doesn't put a hole in that, and there should be another piece of metal covering this joint. We're not going to do that. I'm just going to make a mental note to avoid those areas when installing the new drywall. So I'm taking the measurements for the right side piece of drywall that I need, and then I also go into measuring what I need for the trap door. So I'm focusing on getting a rough fit on the big right hand side, and I'm focusing on how I'm going to make this new door. before I rough fit the drywall, I want to get all these nails out of the 2x4. And some guys just pound these into the stud, and I don't recommend that because then they wind up bending nails by hitting one when they put the new drywall in. And you also want to get these joints all cleaned up as good as you can so we get an accurate fit on the new drywall. And here I'm taking another measurement on the access plug door that I'm about to make. There's a number of ways to do this, but what I do is cut along the perimeter of, the door, and then drill a hole through the center of the door with a hole cutter, and then cut out from the razor blade to the perimeter, and then just knock it out. Remember, this is just a rough cut. That door opening will be all cleaned up nice and pretty. The bottom edge needs to come off the floor, and I'll explain that later. And the left side of this drywall, the vertical line, needs to be more centered with that 2x4 so the other piece can also share that 2x4. So pretty much everything has to be, a little bit touched up, a little bit more centered, and a little bit more cut. So it's always best to go big because you can always cut more off. And there are ways to put more back on, but that's not what this video is about. So we'll get that in another video. And now that that opening is exactly lined up and perfectly centered, I want to reinforce it right now, because when you leave openings like this with drywall, they tend to chip up and get broken up. And kids get in there and they break them, and a lot can go wrong. And even if the plumber came back and had to snake it out again, he's going to screw it up. And you just want to get this as reinforced as you can. So I'm using a drywall joint tape to clean this up, and it's the mesh kind that can breathe, and this should add more strength to that opening. Well, we got the right hand piece of drywall looking good, and now we're moving on to the left hand piece of drywall, and we're cutting an access hole for the pipe. And this is just a rough cut. This will all have to be worked after we rough fit the drywall. So if we walk up to the drywall and take a good look, we can see it needs to be cut better at the top. And this is kind of a diagonal cut here. just because the piece of drywall I was using was not square. And yeah, we're going to have to come back and ream that pipe hole, and we're going to have to fill that big gap on the left hand side, and we're going to have to get this drywall off the floor, so we also have to cut the bottom. The reason you want the drywall off the floor, both of these have to be cut at the bottom. And the problem is, if you ever have a flood, you're going to have to replace your drywall because, again, it's going to absorb the water like a sponge. So it's just a precautionary measure. And as you can see, again, as I mentioned, we have to get this drywall off this pipe. And yeah, there's places where it can be cut and reamed out. And you can see where the old drywall is about a half inch off the floor. That's where this drywall has to be cut. And don't worry too much about how the bottom looks because the baseboard will cover up the gap. Just mark it and go square to that line and just get it off the floor. And here you'll see me marking the stud lines and just going straight down 90 degrees from those lines all the way to the floor. And do not forget the places where you have to avoid because we don't want to put a screw or a nail into a pipe. And I'm forcing this off the floor. Actually, I'm using one of those carpenter pencils to keep this drywall off the floor. Just put anything under there that will keep the top of the drywall pressed against the old drywall and just get it off the floor. And yeah, I'm using nails. You can use drywall screws if you prefer to do it that way. The important thing is just go up and down those stud lines and make sure it's pressed in nice and tight. Here I'm using some of the shavings from the drywall to fill in this gap right here, but I don't recommend doing that. I think you should just pack it with just straight mud. Because when you put the tape over it, doing it this way allows air to get into that joint behind the tape, and eventually it's going to crack the joint. And that's the big enemy with drywall. And you'll see me using the flat tape here instead of the the mesh tape, and I recommend using the mesh tape unless you're an expert at this, because the mesh tape minimizes the air getting behind that joint, and if air does get behind it, it won't crack the joint later on down the road. The next morning I found some air pockets and we need to get these out. Now you cannot paint over them, and they'll bubble up the tape, and here I'll show you a picture of what happens when you paint over these. I guess people think that the paint's going to cover it and no one will ever see it, but these things tend to get worse over time, and eventually they break and the paint peels and it looks dreadful. This here is a seam crack where the drywall comes together, and this is a common issue, and some of this cannot be helped because houses move, they shift, they settle, and they're going to give way at the weakest part of the house, and that's usually the drywall seam. So my best advice is to take a really good look at your work before you put paint over it. And I mean, be anal about it, be an extremist, be a perfectionist about it. And if you take your time, you do it right, you shouldn't have any regrets later on down the road. And the noise that you're hearing in the background is just a shop fan pulling all the dust out of the laundry room and pushing it outside. So because today's the day of sanding, we got a lot of sanding to do and a little bit of mudding. And I'm starting out with very coarse 40 grit, piece of sandpaper, but I'm just knocking down the real high parts of the mud. I'll go from this to 100 grit, and then I'll work my way to 180 grit, and then I think I'm ending up with 240. And each time that you go higher and higher in the sandpaper, it substitutes the scratches from the other sandpaper until it gets more fine and more fine and more fine. And probably the highest you want to go is 240. You don't want to get it like glass, because then the paint just won't have anything to grab a hold of and stick to. So with each time I'm mudding, I'm going to a higher grit sand. And also I'm putting less and less mud on with each round of this. So the mud gets thinner and more feathered out, and the strokes, the sandpaper strokes, get wider and wider and wider to cover the previous scratches. And here you can see we have some craters, and we sanded down to the tape, so we have to cover that up, and just little touch-up stuff. So with each time that you spread mud and sand it, you should have less and less of these tiny little errors until there's nothing to fix. Day 3 has begun, and people ask me what takes me so long to do stuff around the house. And the number one, I'm not working on this 8 hours a day. A couple of these days, I was only working like an hour and a half or 2 hours. So I'm taking my time on it. I'm just getting to it when I have time to do it. And number two, I want it to be nice. I mean, I live here. So before you go ahead and troll me and leave nasty comments or whatever you plan to do because you're super duper drywall installer YouTube server, understand that we're only on day 3 and this goes up to 9 days. Yeah, by the 8th and 9th day, I start losing a little bit of patience with myself, and I just set my sights on getting it done. And plus, I have a sink to install, I have the painting to do, and I have that access door to take care of too. And I want that access door to be right, even though I think it's not up to code. I'm not really sure. But I think I read somewhere that it has to be 24 inches off the floor, or at least 24 inches off the floor. Anyway, let's get on with it. Just sit back, drink a beer, and make a TV dinner. Relax, dig on the music, and just try to chill. As you get along this far, you're spreading the mud thinner and thinner. You don't want to do a whole lot of sanding at this point, so you don't want to use a whole lot of mud, and you really want to feather those edges. So from where you lay the spreader down, you're pressing hard and then lightening up on the spreader where you need the mud, and then you're putting pressure on it again when you're ending. So it takes a little bit of practice to do this right. You're thinking about spending too much time sanding at this point, and that's probably because I laid the mud a little too thick in the beginning. But this is just a really, really thin skin coat at this point. So here's another thing that made this job a little bit longer than it should have been. It took a little bit more time than it should have. And while I was over there working on, what I'm working on, I saw this up here and I was like, holy smokes. So I needed a paint chip to take to the paint store to match up the paint. And I was like, well, here's a whole bunch of them right here. So then, I debated it, but then I said, yeah, let's go ahead and take care of that now while we got all the tools here and we're ready to go. And this is just me scraping off the paint. And I'm not going to take a super long time on this. I'm just kind of just going to keep that crack from spreading anymore. I want to get these paint chips off and feathered out. And just take care of it so it doesn't look as bad as it does today. And this day turns out to be pretty long. I think I spent 8 or 10 hours on this day taking care of a whole lot of stuff. But we get a lot done, and it's kind of the offbeat stuff, and I have to make a frame for that door, that access opening for the drain plug. And I think I get to the drywall priming too, so we're going to cover the drywall and primer, just the places where we worked, and see how that comes up in the morning tomorrow morning. The drywall primer will highlight any last second errors, so after that dries, then it's your last chance to fix any mistakes. And on this frame, I'm using thin pieces of wood behind the drywall to give the screws something to bite into, and this way you won't screw up your drywall trying to just screw it into the drywall. You want something in the back of the drywall for the screw to bite into. And here's one of the last minute repairs that I need to do, and there'll be a couple more air bubbles that I had to cut out, and this is it. We're on the last mile. You can see in this picture that all the drywall dust has been vacuumed up from the floor, and I'm about to use a very lightly damped cloth. You don't want it soaking wet on the wall itself to get the dust off the wall. And now we're going to prime this whole section and the other section that we've been working on, and this is drywall primer. Well, the next day I decided I was not happy with the door I made, so now I'm making another one. And actually, I think before this video ends, I wind up making a third one. And then I'm finally satisfied with it. But we'll get to that when we get to it. Let's get on down the road. Yeah, I'm going to take that access door and the frame off and paint the frame black, so I can paint the blue, the actual wall, while the frame is off. And I do wind up making another door. And I was a little bit, picky about that, so I wanted to take care of that. And right now I'm just, doing some very light sanding with 240 grit sandpaper and just getting ready for paint. And now I have to clean the wall off. I have to vacuum everything up and make sure everything is clean. Then I have to do all the taping and lay down some newspaper or whatever, anything that's going to protect your floor. And yeah, we're almost good to go. So this day is almost over. I'm going to be heading to bed soon. It's been a long day, and everything is groovy, man. Let's do this. the drywall, all the painting, all the mudding, all that stuff is finished, and now we're just doing the baseboard, which is going to be white, and the quarter round, which is also going to be white, and then the sink. And then the sink had a leak in it, so that's the last minute problem. By the time I got done with that, I was exhausted, so I saved all the cleanup for tomorrow. The rest of that baseboard will be painted white to match the new baseboard. And I had to cut a notch in the baseboard to fit around this access door. And also, you'll see me going into customizing the cabinet where the sink goes on top of it. Because it had been all waterlogged, there was actually a leak in the sink, and it just kind of rotted away, so I had to cut out all the rotted wood. And I wanted to put the baseboard along that whole wall, so I had to make the cabinet fit around the baseboard instead of cutting the baseboard at the cabinet.